The nursing home was quiet that day, as it often was. Sunlight filtered weakly through a small window, casting soft shadows on the white walls. Inside, Arthur, an 82-year-old man with thinning silver hair and wrinkled hands, sat in his worn armchair, staring out of the window. Outside, the world moved on. Cars passed by, leaves rustled in the autumn wind, but none of it reached Arthur's room. He felt separated from it all, forgotten. Arthur had been living in this nursing home for 3 years. At first, his family visited every week. His daughter Emma would bring his grandchildren, and for a few hours, the room would fill with laughter and joy. They'd talk about the children's school, their new hobbies, and the world outside. But over time, the visits became less frequent. Once a week turned into once a month, and then eventually, they stopped altogether. Arthur understood. Life was busy, people had their own lives to live. But the loneliness gnawed at him. He gazed at the old clock on the wall, its ticking filling the silence. It was his birthday today, 82 years old. He didn't expect much, maybe a phone call or a card, but as the minutes dragged on, the silence only deepened. On the small table beside him sat a birthday card Emma had mailed the previous year. Now yellowed and dusty, the last one she'd sent. He looked at it, its once cheerful colors now faded. To the best dad in the world, it read in her familiar handwriting. He touched the card, tracing her words with his finger. His thoughts drifted to better times, times when he wasn't so alone. He remembered the bustling family gatherings they used to have, Christmases filled with laughter, the smell of roast dinner filling the air, and children running around, making noise. He and his wife Margaret would sit in the kitchen together, preparing meals for everyone, their hands moving in sync as they had done for decades. Margaret had passed 5 years ago, and it was after that the silence truly began. He missed her every day. Sometimes late at night he would wake up, half expecting to feel her beside him, the soft rustle of her breath next to his. But it was always just the cold emptiness of the bed. After she died, Arthur had hoped his family would fill that void, but they had their own lives, their own distractions. It wasn't their fault, he told himself over and over again, but it didn't make the loneliness any easier. In the garden outside, a few of the other residents sat with their visitors, their laughter drifting faintly through the window. Arthur's heart ached as he watched them. He wondered if Emma thought of him, if she ever felt a pang of guilt for not coming. He didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to ask for more than she could give, but the pain of being forgotten was one he could not escape. With a deep sigh, he reached for the scrapbook on his bedside table. It was worn, the edges frayed from years of being handled. He opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. Each photo was a window into a past that felt almost like a different life. There was his wedding day, the black and white photo of him and Margaret beaming with joy. Next, a picture of Emma as a baby, her tiny hand gripping his finger. There were family holidays, birthdays, school events, page after page of memories that now felt distant, like looking through a foggy window into a world he could never return to. Arthur's fingers paused on a photo of him and Margaret in their garden, laughing as they planted flowers together. He could almost hear her voice, feel the warmth of her presence beside him. A tear slid down his cheek, and he quickly wiped it away. He hadn't cried in years. He didn't allow himself to. What was the point? It wouldn't change anything. The sun began to set, casting long shadows in the room. Arthur closed the scrapbook and rested it on his lap, staring out at the darkening sky. He knew he was nearing the end of his life, and the thought didn't frighten him. It was the idea of leaving with no one remembering him that filled him with a quiet despair. He wondered if, when the time came, anyone would even notice. As he sat there, lost in thought, there was a soft knock on the door. His heart leapt, hope briefly flaring in his chest. Could it be Emma? Had she come after all? The door creaked open and a nurse entered, her face warm but apologetic. She brought in a small tray with his evening tea and a single cupcake with a candle in it. "Happy birthday, Arthur," she said kindly, placing the tray on the table. Arthur forced a smile. "Thank you." The nurse hesitated for a moment, sensing the loneliness in his eyes, before giving a small nod and leaving him alone once more. Arthur looked at the cupcake, the flickering candle casting a soft glow in the dim room. He thought of making a wish, but what was there to wish for anymore? His heart was heavy with the things he could never have back, the family he had loved, the woman he had shared his life with, the feeling of being needed. With a deep breath, he blew out the candle, watching the small puff of smoke curl up into the air. He stared at the empty chair across from him and whispered into the quiet room, "I miss you, Margaret." As the night deepened, Arthur sat there in the silence, surrounded by the ghosts of his memories. The loneliness was unbearable, but he clung to the past, the only thing he had left. And so he waited for a phone call, a visit, anything to remind him that once he had mattered to someone.